just a little bit. It's really echoing from here. Let's try it again. Okay, I think we're about ready to begin. Thank you. So I hope everybody's doing well this morning. Last week we were located in Babylon about this time. We've escaped and we're going to try to filter back in and begin our lesson again. So hopefully you remember a little bit about what we talked about last week. We were talking about the origin, and keep this, I know it's confusing, but keep it in mind the perspective that we want to do. We are talking about the origin of the Hebrew Bible. Last week we talked about the origin of the Hebrew Bible according to the Torah, according to the law. And there were three main points that we wanted to cover and did cover about that. Today we're going to begin to look at the origin of the Hebrew Bible according to the prophets, okay? So last week we said that there were three things that we were talking about. In Exodus, we found two references that Moses wrote and asked the question, what's the first recorded writings of the Bible that we find in the Bible? The first one was actually written down by Moses as instructed by God as do you remember what the first one was? In order to do what? Remember, okay? Remember that the Israelites, the children of Israel, relatively quickly after they have escaped Pharaoh and have crossed the river or the sea, and they're now in the wilderness but have not yet arrived at Mount Sinai. So they were easy pickings, or so a lot of people thought, because of all the treasure and gold that they had. And Moses and Joshua, through God's help, prevented that from happening, and they actually defeated that tribe that had come in. And God instructed Moses to write down in a scroll so that that would be a remembrance of the Israelites' rescue. Okay? Now, those things are important. The aspect of rescue, obviously, is one of the things that we've talked about numerous times in Luke chapter 24 that Jesus said that he had come to do. So that his people could be rescued from God's wrath, basically. So that was number one. Number two, do you remember that? That writing was taking place by Moses at Mount Sinai in the form of the beginnings of God's law, okay? What was the purpose of this one? You remember? A covenant relationship from God to fulfill the promise that was made to Abraham way back when, okay? And the basic premise for that was that if you obey my will, you as a people are invited to a covenant relationship with me in order to do what? Be a holy nation and a people of priests, to be a representative of God in his kingdom, in his world. So that was the second one. And the third one that we had mentioned was at the end of Deuteronomy. Remember, we're in the Torah still. So this is the last thing you got to remember on this one. And the last thing was Moses was instructed to compose and teach a song, you remember that? which he did at the end of Deuteronomy, it was to accomplish two things. One was to basically draw attention to the fact that the people, in spite of their covenant relationship, were going to fail miserably. And at the end of Deuteronomy, we find that that poem, we said, was a reminder of their failure. In other words, a conviction, a witness, so that when the people read this or heard it on down the line, that they would be reminded of their failure to keep the promise that they had made to Yahweh. Additionally, it's not left there, and this is an important fact too, that the people were to be reminded that there was a future hope, that it was dependent upon their reconciliation, their coming back to God. But if they did this thing, if they did that the covenant could be reestablished with his people, and that the rescue again could take place, that we find. Now, it's helpful to me to remember that all of this and the whole purpose of the Old Testament is to do what? If that's a question that you were asked, how would you answer that? What was the purpose of the Old Testament? It's a fair question. It's a big book. It's a big collection of chapters of the book.
I think it kind of helps you to know the nature of God and how he works with his people, what his plan and purpose is. It just shows you that whole history of the relationship with God and man.
Okay. So we have the relationship between God and man. Anything else? Okay, what did Jesus say in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus and in privacy with his disciples and apostles? What did he say the purpose of it was? The Torah, the law, the prophets, and the writings. He makes it very clear that it was to do what? Point to his coming, okay? And if we have to sum up, I think, the whole purpose of the Old Testament, it is to clarify that Jesus is coming, that the failure of the covenant relationship, our betrayal of our trust in God, and putting all of these other things ahead of God, was a reminder that God has provided, according to his relationship with his people, this covenant relationship, that God has provided an avenue of rescue. If we will remember that, we can very easily, I think, deal with all of the complications that come from looking at the Old Testament. So today we're going to continue, and I hope you have a handout. Did everybody get one that wants one? There's a lot of information here. I don't know how much we will cover today. If we can get through it, fine, because I don't want to just continue to hash out something. But if you, but you're going to have to do probably some reflection on this aspect of this handout, because there's some really good information here. So the story that we find through the prophets, and again, there's a central story that we want to remember through all of the prophets. The writers or the people of the Hebrew folks took great emphasis in looking at the prophets, and that's true, because Moses was considered to be a prophet right on through the Old Testament. The majority of what we find, other than the law, are prophets. The other parts, the writings, as the Jews called them, were a supplement, really, to the information that the prophets had. So when we look at the Psalms, the Song of Solomon, all of the poetry type books, this is an effort and a way of looking at God's power, looking at His promise, looking at practical applications of what they were to be fulfilling in the law. But the prophets were the ones who told the story of Israel and their failure to do that. We left Moses off, and do you remember what at the end of Deuteronomy it talks about Moses, and what did it say? That Moses was an ultimate example, and yet, you remember what it said? That there has not been, but will be, it's intimated in there, a prophet who is greater than Moses, one who is to come that's greater than Moses. So no amount of putting Moses on a pedestal, as the Jews often did not accomplish the fact to remind them that there was one who was coming who was greater than Moses. And it continues in that same vein throughout. He turned things over, of course, to Joshua. And we talked about that, which was very reflective, I think, on not only what Joshua did, but the other prophets too. You find that on your handout in Joshua 1. God instructed Joshua to be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the Torah which Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left. You're going to find that reiterated over and over again throughout the Old Testament, that they were to maintain a straight and narrow path so that you may have success wherever you go. This scroll of the Torah shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. And that's what Joshua did. When they talk about not letting it depart from the mouth, basically what that means is Joshua was instructed to meditate and not only read and disperse it, but we talked about he was to whisper it to himself. He was to meditate on it. He was to reflect. He was to become as we say, a Bible or a Torah nerd. And that's exactly what he did. He adhered to that day and night. And the Bible says that as long as Joshua was alive, what did the people do? A lot of silence out there. What did the people do as long as Joshua was alive?
Obeyed God.
They obeyed God. They adhered to exactly what Joshua was doing. Him and the other elders. In other words, they were doing what was right in the sight of God. Look at these verses in Joshua 8, beginning in verse 30. Joshua wrote there on stones a copy of the Torah of Moses, which he had written, in the presence of the sons of Israel. All Israel, with their elders and officers and their judges, were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priest who carried the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. Then afterward he read all the words of the Torah, the blessings and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of Torah. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel. It mentions down there that after Moses, Joshua was considered to be a guardian, one who guarded the law, the Torah. He did what God commanded him to do. He was the mainstay. And this is basically the story that we find of as we develop into the prophets, that was their function. And it's really interesting to look at where these people came from and what they did and their perspective on things. There's an example that you can't really read, but this was, I understand, found, look at the little picture in the lower right-hand corner. That's a picture of a stela that was found about 150 or 200 years ago, going back to the 9th century BC. Can you tell what it's written on? Literally is about, I would say, this big from what I understand, about a yard. And it's written on a stone from this particular period. This would have been very similar, it's believed, to what Joshua would have written the Torah on. Now, you can look at a stone that big, and you can write a lot of information on that with a chisel, I guess, but you cannot write on a stone the entire Torah as we have it in the Bible. So when he says it's very similar to the writings of the Ten Commandments that God did, you can get information on there. And this would more than likely have been the basics of the Torah. Those things which Moses and Joshua, continuing, was the most important aspects of what the law encompassed. It's interesting to note that this was placed alongside the ark, which already had the scroll that was written for this information. So this is a secondary reinforcement of the law, which was read and kind of established the criteria for the public readings that we have throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament too. That information which came from God was to be publicly read and disseminated to the people so that they could understand what was going on. Is there any questions about that part? So don't get lost. I know that this is complicated. You know, it's really interesting. This is an aside. Last night, we had a really good devotional at Military Outreach, and Garrett was presenting that based on Caleb's sermon from last week. It coincidentally, it was where they had been exiled in Babylon. And Garrett's question basically was, how do we maintain and walk in the world and yet adhere to what we do as Christians? What did they do as Israelite children in a captive land? And it's really interesting because you can go back and God deals with this, and we'll get to hopefully a scripture in Isaiah that explained basically the whole summary of what I think our purpose and ability and what we're to do in as we as Christians walk in a foreign land. There's not many of us here who don't regret the fact that our nation in so many ways, our leaderships in so many ways have parted ways with biblical teachings. Most of us are concerned about that. We're concerned for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren as we go through that. And yet, the Bible explains how we are to approach that and still have that relationship with God that we're instructed to do. So again, that's an aside, and I guess stresses to me the importance of us maintaining and reading and understanding all of Scripture, not just what we pick out to choose from the New Testament about Jesus, because Jesus' society, Joshua's society, Isaiah's society, all had similar type problems that they dealt with, and yet there was a thread of people throughout these hundreds of years. We're not talking about 20 years. We're not talking about looking back to when we were kids growing up. We're talking centuries of continual problems facing the same type situation. And yet, the Bible tells us that we have been successful, that God has been successful in maintaining that thread of people that have continued from the past throughout history. What does that say? And this is not covered here, this is me. What does that say about our purpose as Christians to you? Put you on the spot. You hadn't said a word the whole time, hardly. So it's your time. What does this fact say about what our purpose is as Christians, one of them? What are we to try to accomplish as we walk through this world? No matter... Do what?
To be the salt of the earth.
To be the salt of the earth.
Deal with abortion, same-sex marriage, and all that kind of stuff.
What does it say to you, Billy, about that? How do we do that? That ain't gonna work today. You're pretty good at trying to flip the question, John.
That same phrase for what Poppy said. And what came to mind for me, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, but regardless, what came to mind to me was not so much that if we're to be the salt of the earth, that we're supposed to be in a salt shaker on the shelf while the meal sits at the table. I think to be the salt of the earth and to be the salt that is supposed to be what Jesus was describing would mean that you have to be sprinkled on the food. And you have to bring flavor to the food. And you have to bring goodness to the food. And so I don't know that He created this world for us to be completely separated from, as if it is a mistake and we're all here by mistake. We're here for a reason. The world's here for a reason. Salt is spread on food for a reason. And so I think part is trying to understand what that is and to understand that it's good without the salt becoming polluted by the food, but for the salt to give flavor to the food.
So how do we get salty? How do we get salty? If we need to be salty, whether it's on the shelf in a shaker or whether it's applied, salty, how do we become salty?
I think through spiritual practices and through knowing our Creator and understanding what He created us for, understanding the circle of people that we have around us, what impact we can and should have in a positive way on them. And I think it has to come from above. I think it has to be Jesus and the Spirit.
So let me find, it's in here somewhere. Let's see if this is it. Look in Isaiah chapter 11. I'm sorry, chapter 8. Let's read a few verses. So you remember when Isaiah prophesied? Remember that? Okay. We kind of get lost in our time frame sometime on this, but Isaiah prophesied a long time ago. I think, without going back and looking, it was around 900 BC, along in there sometime. Now, they were caught up at this particular time in a lot of political mess. There was a lot of controversy even at this time. That's what I say, the years may go by, but times and people really haven't changed. So we have a lot of unrest that has gone by, a lot of political intrigue, many, many times. So Isaiah says, "For the Lord spoke thus to me with his strong hand upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread." And this is really where the rubber meets the road. "But the Lord of hosts," this is a continuation of what the Lord is saying to Isaiah in verse 13. "But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken, and they shall be snared and taken." But what does the Lord tell Isaiah that he is to do? It says it right there. What does it say? Well, he does in verse 16 say that. He says, "Bind up the testimony, seal the teachings among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him." So what was Isaiah to do? With all of this turmoil, with all of this tornadic activity that was going on around him in the city, God tells Isaiah to do what?
Honor God.
Honor God. You fear me. You don't fear other people. You keep my commandments and concentrate on me regardless of what's going on in the world around us. Now, my question is that applicable today? I think in our lifetime it could not be more applicable today. What does this say about our actions now, today, currently, as far as the future of the church is concerned? A lot of books out there about concerns about the church, about God's kingdom, the demise amongst every denomination that you read about. People are not going to church. Is church going to end? Is Christianity going to end? Is God's covenant relationship with his people going to end? And I see a lot of head shakes going on. If we shake our head and say that Christians are going to continue to survive and thrive, where does that put us today? What is our job?
And then to spread it around, like John was saying, be the active salt, the active yeast, and the language here in 16, bind up this testimony, seal up, it meant to write it down. It didn't mean keep it to yourself. It meant the opposite. It meant, his intention was for Isaiah and all the prophets to, spread it out. So that's what we did. We have to keep it going,
Isn't it interesting that there would be disciples in Isaiah's time? A lot of times we think of these prophets as being one-offs, that there's a major prophet, that God instructed him, that in his spiritual-led ability to communicate God's desire. But there was more than that, There were disciples of God. There were disciples of Isaiah in Isaiah's time. We find evidence of that throughout the Old Testament as well as the New Testament too. So there were groups of people. There's a Hebrew word, starts with an L, it's in there somewhere. But it means the learned ones. What do they call it when somebody is connected and learning a trade? What do they call that word? Apprenticeships, yes. That Isaiah had apprenticeships, and that they were to learn and do what? Pass it along. So in a world of turmoil, God instructs us to adhere to his teachings, and that we are to focus on that and not what goes on in the world around us. That's very difficult to do. It really is. But by doing that, and often I think we dismiss this, the fact that we have, as Christians, an active role in maintaining the future of the church by adhering to what God says that we are to do on it. Does that make sense? David?
Let me read Isaiah 9, verses 19 through the rest of the chapter there. I think it applies to as well as it did in those days. It says, when they say to you, consult the leaders, spirits, and whisper and murmur, should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead and live on behalf of the living? To the Lord, law, and the testimony, they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no power. They will cast their thirst to finish, they will turn out when they are hungry, they will be enraged and curse their king, their God, as they face up. Then they will look to the earth and hope, distress, darkness, gloom, and anger. They will be driven into the darkness. And I think how applicable is that today in our society. In these times, people have left following God for the larger part.
But notice God's response at the time of Isaiah. He's basically saying, Isaiah, you keep the faith. Because what? God has already made the decision. Isaiah prophesied before the children of Israel were exiled into Babylon. He prophesied before the northern kingdom was taken over by the Assyrians. So God has said, forget it. Forget the people. If you read other passages, you're going to find that he's abandoned his temple. He's abandoned the Passover. And this is coming from God saying, I'm doing this because these people are so retribute that I'm giving up on them. He's not giving up on the future, but he's giving up on the leadership and the positions that people found themselves at that particular time. When it says to bind up, to roll up, and seal those scrolls, he's basically saying, my history with the people in general is going to have to wait until a future date. And that's exactly what happened. The people were exiled, and yet you had a continual thread, a very minority group that continued to follow and uphold what Jesus or what God had said to do. So the story of the Hebrew Bible and the prophets is based, this just didn't, we're talking thousands of years. And this Bible just didn't automatically all of a sudden appear. It was put together and basically seamed so that what we have, the total message, is a culmination of God's purpose that He wanted to convey on this. Again, I get off track sometime, but we get awfully carried away with our limited view of time, don't we? We're here for a very short period of time, but this took place in God's instructions, and this small group of dedicated Bible nerds continued over and over through many periods of time. So again, I think one thing that we as Christians need to remember, we quoted from 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, I don't remember which one, 15, toward the end of it. He said, don't give up the faith, because the work that you are doing now is important to continue the gospel message. And I don't know whether you caught wind of that when we read this about the stumbling block. Does that sound familiar? If not, it should. Paul in Romans talks about a stumbling block. Peter talked about a stumbling block to the people, so that what can be a sanctuary, what can be a refuge, that being God, just at the same time can cause people to stumble and be an offense to them because of that. Any questions that we got? Okay. I want you to look on the back page. And this is toward the end, and I can tell it's almost time for the first bell, so we're not going to have time to finish this up, and I would probably like to look at some of these additional scriptures that maintain this. But in Isaiah's time, you see Isaiah, he's the one that has the beard, and there's a king behind him. And what is the king doing? In stick figure, he's giving him the what? The hand. Isaiah, we don't want anything to do with you. Your message is falling on deaf ears. You just forget about it. Who else is involved there other than the king? You get a hint by his paraphernalia on the top of his head. Who would that represent? The priest. Yeah. So during the time of Isaiah, everybody's corrupt. The king's corrupt. The priests are corrupt. The judges and all of the people who should be more pertinent are completely corrupt. And that's where, notice the scroll, it's rolled up. And this is where Isaiah is told by God is these people have been prepared for doom. Their time in Jerusalem is limited, and you bind up this scroll until a future time. And in the meantime, the disciples that he has continue to carry this information on through the time of exile, the time of their doom, complete in the captivity by Babylon and taken away. And you have prophets then from then on who basically see Zechariah. What's Zechariah done with the scroll? He has opened that scroll that Isaiah has sealed up at God's command. And Zechariah has opened that scroll and looked back on the failures of Israel to uphold what they have promised God to do. Okay? So when you look at that little picture, I think it's a really good picture. Pointing back to the former prophets by Zechariah. And again, the purpose of this is to understand the origin of the Hebrew Bible according to the prophets and how that story continues right on through from the oldest to the most recent prophets. Okay? Do you grasp that concept? I want to make sure that we're not getting lost on there. Are there any questions? First bell has rung.
I have one question. On that first page, that proto-Torah,
Mm-hmm.
can you explain that?
A proto-Torah would mean simply a composite of the complete thing, not necessarily in full, but the high points of it, the things that would have been the most important and were written on stone. Prototype, yeah, a representation of the full thing on it. And that's where we were saying that there's no way that the whole thing could have been written on stones, therefore what God considered the most important things would have been done. That's not surprising. What was God's ultimate displeasure with the children of Israel throughout these centuries over and over again? You know, we kind of make that overly complicated sometimes, and I think it sheds light on our perception of Christianity today. What was God's displeasure? Idolatry. The failure that they did not consider the 10th commandment says, "Thou shalt have" what? "No other gods before me." And if you look at a historical perspective in the Old Testament, that was the main thing that they did over and over and over again was failure to keep that commandment. And it started before Moses could even get down from Mount Sinai. You know, when we consider that the people were down on the ground and you've got smoke and thunder and had to be a very disturbing application. You know, they couldn't tolerate that. What did they think that they had to have? A figure that represented God. And we'll talk about that probably next week a little bit, is that continued. What did the children of Israel eventually want to have as a figure of God? Basically, the kings. And it was an absolute, utter failure. I don't think you'll find anywhere else in Eastern society where the establishment of kingship is described at the very beginning as a lost cause. Why was it a lost cause to the people? Simply because they tried to replace God with a human representation. And remember, a lot of societies did that. The Egyptians, their God, their king, their ruler, their pharaoh was God on earth. Even in Roman times, if I'm not mistaken, they considered the king, the emperor, to be God on earth on it. So again, this all ties back in my opinion, to the fact that we need to remember our purpose and our looking toward God as our king, not an earthly king and not an earthly representative. Any other questions? All right, thanks everybody.